But we have Robin Steinberg. She's CEO of the Bail Project. And the Bail Project is an organization that's on a mission to end cash bail and create a more just, equitable, and humane pretrial system. She was originally a public defender in the Bronx. She founded 3 high-impact organizations there, including the Bronx Defenders, which is a great name. And she moved to California 5 years ago. There's just one state in the District of Columbia that has functionally eliminated cash bail. And we'll have her website in our newsletter, but we have her here today to talk to us. Christine Soto de Berry, if she does come, she is the founder and executive director of Prosecutors Alliance. And so I'll say more about her when she comes in. So we were going to have both of them speak and ask each other questions, as well as I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure you will have a lot of questions when you hear Robin speak. I do want to say that this is an informal discussion, so she's going to give a presentation. We're not doing slides, but please raise your hand if you're here at the library, and if you're on chat, please raise your hand or put something in chat. I think that was it. Oh, I did have one other thing. Just in talking about our theme, today we're reimagining a world in which systems of support and care and not punishment create public safety. So that's why we're focusing on the bail, cash bail. Okay, so Robin, why don't you start?
Sure. So you want me to sit here or go up there?
No, you can go right there.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming and for having a conversation with me about this incredibly important topic. As had been alluded to in my brief bio, I really came at this issue having been a public defender for 35 years and watching client after client of mine being held in jail cells because they didn't have enough money in their bank account to pay their cash bail. And even when you're a really, really dedicated public defender fighting every single day, sometimes it all boiled down to whether your client had enough money to be free to fight their case or whether they were going to remain locked in the jail cell. Because what that inevitably will mean is that your client is going to plead guilty whether they did it or not. They're going to plead guilty whether they should or not. They're going to plead guilty over 90% of the time, because being held in a jail cell, no matter where it is in the country, is a horrifying, terrifying, dehumanizing, and violent experience, and people will plead guilty whether they did it or not to go home to safety. That's just the fact. So I watched client after client, being held in jail, and me saying, no, don't plead guilty to this case. They shouldn't have brought the case. There's no evidence. We can beat this case. And your client turning to you and saying, I don't have the $500 in cash to pay to be free. And so if the fastest way to get home is to plead guilty, tell the judge I'll plead guilty. And so that's the dynamic, right, of the cash bail system in this country. Cash bail is the primary driver of mass incarceration in America. It is responsible for 99% of jail growth over the past 20 years in America. We have 3,000 local jails across this country, and in each of those local jails, the majority of people are there because they have not paid their cash bail, not because they have been convicted of a crime, and not because they are serving a sentence. Most people don't understand that. Most people think our jails are crowded with people who've been convicted and sentenced and are doing their time. The majority of people in those jails have yet to be convicted, and evidence has yet to be brought into a courtroom to prove their guilt or innocence. So that should be enough of a reason for us to care about bail and care about the cash bail system. I'd argue that the other reason we should care about it is how our criminal justice system operates, whether it touches your family personally, whether it touches somebody that you have known, or whether it's never touched you or a family member personally. It is a reflection of all of us, because our criminal justice system reflects our values as Americans and our values as people who believe in, I still hope, democracy and what that means. And the values that underlie our criminal justice system are meant to be everybody who is charged with a crime in America is entitled to the presumption of innocence. That's not a legal technicality. That's not a legal term. That is a fundamental value that holds up our entire system, which is until government brings evidence, objective, credible evidence, into a courtroom and asks people to find your guilt or innocence, you are presumed innocent. That should apply to each and every one of us. That value, along with equal justice under the law, those two values are completely eroded by the cash bail system. Because the cash bail system puts cash money as the ticket you have to pay to be free to fight your case before you've been convicted. So you can understand the ways in which it erodes the presumption of innocence. And certainly it erodes our ideas that we believe in, and our system represents equal justice under the law. Because think about it. If you have to pay money to get out, you're creating a two-tier system of justice. One for people that can pay their way out, and one for people that cannot. Because the consequences to not being able to pay your cash bail affect you in that jail cell, who will be subjected to both physical and emotional harm that will stay with you for the rest of your lives. It will create an incentive for you to plead guilty, whether you did or didn't do the crime. And it will destabilize your life and your family's life outside of the jail cell that you're being held. So it isn't even just you. It's your job, it's your school, it's your kids, it's your home, it's your immigration status. It's anything that might be impacted by being held in that jail cell. So it is an incredibly destructive force. Our cash bail system was built upon the idea that if a judge set bail in an amount that you could pay before conviction, that is the thing that would incentivize you to return to court. I mean, if you think about it, intuitively, maybe it makes a little bit of sense, right? You think, well, you have something on the line. So cash bail was actually supposed to be a form of release. It was designed to be a release mechanism, but that would require a judge to set an amount of bail that reflected your financial ability to pay, right? So if you don't have any money, right, the judge ought to take that into consideration, maybe not set cash bail at all, or set cash bail in an amount that you can make. So you'd expect bails to look like $5, $20, $150, random numbers. I know when I practiced in the Bronx, I never saw a judge set bail that wasn't in an increment of $500. That was just the culture. 500, 1,000, 1,500, 20, it was like somehow that got written in. So when you think about cash bail and you think about the inequity that it creates, you also need to recognize it's the driver of mass incarceration. It is also a driver of racial disparities in our criminal legal system, which exist in every single area of our criminal legal system, from who gets arrested to how people get charged to what they get charged with to cash bail setting. But cash bail also falls disproportionately on low-income communities and communities of color. So it is, again, a driver of mass incarceration, a driver of the perpetuation of racial injustice in this country and in our criminal legal system, and it creates a two-tier system of justice that erodes the fundamental principles, right? So it's a pretty awful thing. Why do we have it? So why do we have it? Well, systems don't go down without a fight, right? So the system got created a long time ago on the idea that if you put up enough money, that'll provide the reason for you to come back to court. And nobody really tested that entire idea. So in 2005, my husband David and I, who was also a public defender, started something called the Bronx Freedom Fund in Bronx, New York. It was a revolving bail fund. We spent 2 years trying to get one donation. It was a long time ago, and finally got one donation from one guy and his dad to basically say, you know what? You guys are crazy, but why don't you see what would happen if you used philanthropic dollars to pay bail for somebody? Would they come back to court? After all, they have no skin in the game, right? They have no money on the line. They have no financial interest in coming back. So we decided to test it. And to be honest, we had no idea what was going to happen. I thought clients would come back because I'd been working long enough in the system to think, well, it's in your best interest to come back. But maybe they're right. Maybe money is what provided the incentive. So we began to pay bail in the Bronx with a very small revolving bail fund that had $100,000 in it, called the Bronx Freedom Fund. And we tested that for 10 years. And our clients came back to court 95% of the time. So it really did lay waste to the myth that cash is what makes people come back to court. But the thing that was even more interesting to me was when we also looked at what's the impact on the criminal case. We know the impact on the human, right? If you're not subjected to violence and degradation and dehumanizing conditions, you're going to do better, right? Your family's not going to suffer if you're able to be home. But what we also saw in the Bronx then was over half the cases got dismissed once somebody was free and could fight their case from freedom. We did that work for 10 years. And then somebody took notice and asked whether I would write a one-pager for them. And honestly, I was just busy being a public defender and doing my work. And it turned out that it was something called the Audacious Project. It was a project of the TED company, the TED Talks. And I put in here's what would happen. And the question they asked me was, what would you do if you could scale the work you've done in the Bronx? What would that look like? And I was like, well, we'd get a lot more people home, and we would test whether or not what we learned in the Bronx is applicable across the country. Is it just an anomaly because the South Bronx is so unusual, or is this something that is a trend at the national level? So we were lucky enough to get the Audacious Prize in 2017. I was notified of that. 2018, I was lucky enough to do a TED Talk. So I did a TED Talk on the annual conference. And we launched the Bail Project, and we opened we have a revolving bail fund, and we began to pay bail in 30 different jurisdictions across America and do the same thing we were doing in the Bronx, intervening and paying bail, tracking the data, elevating the human stories about what happens to people when they're stuck or when they're stuck in jail or they get out of jail, right? And to really make the policy argument that the cash bail system in America is unfair, it's unjust, and it's unnecessary, because that's not what makes people come back to court. So in the past 5 years, we've bailed out over 28,000 people in 30 different places. The data is very, very similar. So what we know is at the national level, our clients come back 92% of the time. Dismissal rates range from 20% in some jurisdictions and all the way up to 70% in other jurisdictions when we intervene and pay bail. So we know that what we learned in the Bronx is a national trend, and we know that cash bail, we know we can affirmatively say there's absolutely no justification for cash bail if what you are concerned about is people coming back to court, which really gets us to the next question, and the one that nobody wants to talk about. Well, I thought cash bail was the way that we keep the community safe. I was like, aha. So that's the second prong of this, right? Once you realize that cash bail has nothing to do with coming back to court, why does it exist? Well, we can't actually believe that money should be the thing that determines, right, whether somebody can be returned to the community safely or not. Because think about that for a second. If you put $100,000 bail on somebody, right, because you are offended by the crime, scared by the crime, worried about whether they're going to reoffend, you're still not addressing public safety, because somebody with money in the bank account can pay it and somebody without money in their bank account can't. So you haven't solved the problem. So the question for reimagining our bail system is, once you eliminate cash bail, and I would advocate very, very strongly that you really begin to think about why we need to eliminate cash bail in this country and why it doesn't work, and it's unnecessary, and it's unjust, and it's unnecessary. We have to reimagine then what comes next, right? What comes next, and what place will be brave enough in the country to eliminate cash bail, right, and begin to reimagine a system. So you might ask, well, I don't understand. If the system is so obviously flawed, if cash bail so obviously doesn't work for public safety reasons, because a rich person can pay and a poor person can't, that doesn't solve the problem. That just means wealthy people who are dangerous get out, and poor people who might be dangerous can't get out. So that's not solving the real problem, right? It creates an unfair system and an unjust system, and we recognize that. Why does it still exist, and why haven't we done better? Like, why haven't we done better? Why haven't we created a different system that isn't unfair, isn't unjust, doesn't perpetuate racism, right? And operates with fairness, right? And the answer to that is there are unbelievably well-invested financial interests in keeping the system exactly the way it is. That's not a surprise when you try to change any system, whether it's public education, whether it's healthcare. I was listening to some of the candidates, what you immediately recognize is how many people have a profit motive to keep the system operating the way it's operating. So where's the profit motive in our cash bail system in America, in our criminal justice system? It's the multi-billion-dollar bail bond industry that is backed by whom? Insurance companies in America, who profit off a cash bail system that creates mass incarceration and perpetuates racial disparities. So what the bail bond industry does is they push forth legislation that create bail schedules, which means that the judge doesn't even set the bail at the beginning with any discretion. The sheriff looks at the schedule that's been passed by the legislature and goes, oh, that's the charge, that's $50,000. That's the charge, that's $25,000, right? So you have that dynamic going on politically, but you also have a system where they're going to profit off the backs of desperate families who will pay them 10% of whatever the money is. The bail bonds person will then pay that will take that 10% from the family, go to court, they have a bunch of papers, and they say to the court, I'll pay you if the guy doesn't come back. That's a whole nother conversation. The truth is the system never holds them accountable for that money, but we don't need to talk about that right now. That'll get me in even more trouble. California has some of the highest bails in the country. Of the 30 sites we've been in, the bails in this state, and I moved from New York to California, which I know is heresy in and of itself, right? And I was like, how did I wind up in the bluest state in the country that has some of the highest bail schedules anywhere, including places like Oklahoma and Louisiana where we operate? So that's a political question. But the cash bail system here in California has created some of the biggest jails in America, including in Los Angeles, which has a humongous pretrial population, meaning a huge group of people who are being held in jail because they don't have money to pay cash bail, not because they've been convicted. So that is the work that we've been doing for the past 5 years. We do the work both with our revolving bail fund. We have paid out over $50 million in bail in 5 years across the country. And here's the thing, what happens about bail. So, because some of you are going like, wait, where does all the money come from? So bail is really clever, because if you put up bail for your loved one and your loved one makes all their court appearances, at the end of the criminal case, the bail money comes back to you. So you can create, which is what we have done, a national revolving bail fund. And so long as people come back, you're going to get that money to come back into the fund, right? And then you can use it again. So that is how sort of we've been able to sort of sustain the work over the past 5 years that way. We have local teams in the 30 different sites. Those local teams are staffed by people from the community. We prioritize hiring people with lived experience. We are very conscientious about not being a national not-for-profit that drops into places that we don't know anything about. We hire locally. If you're operating the bail fund that we are a part of in that local jurisdiction, you are part of that community. You come from that jurisdiction. You have your connections in those areas, and you understand the nuances of your own criminal legal system, which all operate really differently. So we have teams across the country. And that's
you also remind people.
Yes. So here's what we've learned, right? The key, you're all going to go like, really? It took you all this work to do that? I could have told you that. The key to getting people back to court, they need effective court reminders. So think about the dentist appointment that you made for 3 months from now. If my dentist didn't send me a reminder, I would miss it every time. No question. So we actually send text messages to clients. So they need effective court reminders, because our criminal justice system is so antiquated that their idea about how you notify people who are frequently have unstable housing situations, oftentimes are going from place to place. Their solution to notifying people is to send them snail mail that lets them know about their next court date. So you can imagine a lot of those dates never get there. So that's the one thing. The second thing is transportation. So a lot of folks, right, run into obstacles and don't have transportation to get to court. And by the way, recognize that cases can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months to years to resolve in the criminal justice system. So you are asking somebody every month or every 6 weeks to come to court, miss a day of work, have to get childcare, right? Have to pay to get transportation. So a lot of times what we see is clients just need a way of transportation to get to court. So if you provide effective court reminders, and you provide transportation when it's needed, and you also are willing to serve as a connector to social services that somebody might need, you will have a very high success rate in making sure people get back to court, and hopefully the people can thrive, can fight their case alongside with their lawyers, and get a better case disposition or outcome, and one that looks something like justice and not like a coerced guilty plea. That is our hope for the future.
So also, I know you've talked about the bail bond system making money, but also, and it's a question also in our chat about the prosecutors. So how are they preferring cash bail, and what in terms of keeping the person in jail?
Sure. So, and this is when I'm going to talk about systems, not individual prosecutors. I have met some individual prosecutors who have enormous integrity on this issue, who work really hard to make sure that our criminal legal system is more fair. But as a system, how it benefits prosecutors is that if you hold somebody in jail, they are way more likely to plead guilty, and you are way more likely to be able to get through your overworked pile of files that you really can't get through anyway, right? So prosecutors, just like like public defenders, have more work than they can do. And it does create this incentive. If somebody's in jail, chances are they're going to plead guilty. And that makes everybody's job easier. It makes it easier to get a conviction. And if sometimes in some places, and again, I can't speak to every office and every individual, but sometimes if you're working in an office that prioritizes conviction rates, right, the fastest way for you to actually do well in your office is to get conviction rates. And nothing will do that faster than cash bail. You hold somebody on a cash bail, they're going to plead guilty over 90% of the time. Here's the other thing we know from the research, and this is not our research, this is objective, credible scientific evidence that existed before we even launched the Bail Project. You are more likely to commit a crime if you have been held in jail pre-trial than if you were out and free all along. That's just the evidence. That's not me, that's not my advocacy, that's just true. Why? Think about it. Well, because it destabilizes your life, okay? It destabilizes everything about you. And so, it doesn't even make, in the long run, it has a negative impact on public safety, not a positive impact on public safety. So the cash bail thing has in some ways become a proxy for judges, right? And so let's assume judges are acting in the most honorable way possible. That's a hard lift for me, but I'm going to try. Let's assume that the prosecutor is also operating the most honorable way possible. Equally a hard lift sometimes for me, but that's my having been in the system for too long. When you really think about what we're doing, if what we're really talking about is, I'm afraid if this person goes home, he or she is going to cause harm in the community, then let's just talk about that. Then let's just take that out. Let's not pretend that money is the thing, right? So money has become the proxy for a legitimate concern that a judge may have about, if I release this person, are they going to cause harm in the community? And a prosecutor might also have a legitimate concern, right? If we don't set cash bail, this person may harm somebody in the community. So let's talk about that. But cash bail is not what you need to get people to come back to court. So if what we're concerned about, right, is trying to determine when cash bail should be set, when somebody should be held in pretrial and when somebody shouldn't, then let's talk about that, but let's take money out of it, because money is not going to get us to that question, right? That's just going to be a cloud. It's going to be, it's going to basically cloud the real issue that is underlying concern. Yeah.
As an adjunct case, the risk of flight.
Yeah.
Same sort of thing. If there were not a cash bail system, which of course, we hear either the bail is set at $1 million or bail is denied because someone is a flight risk. If you take money out of the equation, would you simply say you would deny related security?
So
if you're afraid of
So we got to repeat the question because the Zoom can't hear.
Oh, sure. So your question is, if you're thinking about flight risk and you take money out of the equation, could you detain somebody without money bail? So the answer is, it depends on the statutes and the legislation that gets passed, right? So very few states have eliminated cash bail yet, but Illinois just passed something called the Safety Act, and I think it's the gold standard of bail reform so far in this country, right? So they passed it this year in the Safety Act. The subsection under the Safety Act is called the PFA, the Pretrial Fairness Act. That act eliminates cash bail. Period. Full stop. Cash is not the conversation anymore. Okay, that's supposed to take effect. That was supposed to have taken effect on January 1st. We'll get it why that didn't happen. But that was supposed to happen. There is a mechanism where if somebody is brought into the system in charge of the crime, a judge has the discretion to determine one of two things that they can use to hold somebody in jail with no cash bail. Just hold them, detain them. One is they are a risk of intentional flight. By the way, that is almost always rich people. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. That is almost always the guy with the private jet on the thing. It is almost never people that are living in communities, working in communities with families, right? Almost never. So that is sort of always an outlier. But if there is evidence that the person might be a risk of intentional flight, they can detain them with no cash. There is no cash. They detain them. If they determine with evidence that needs to be brought forth by government, okay, that's an important critical piece here. It's not based on race. It's not based on stereotypes. It's not based on how you look. It's not based on what you wear. It's not based on your zip code and where you live. It's not even based on the charge itself. It's based on evidence. If there is evidence that a judge has that there is a real and present danger to a person or community, should this person be released, then they can detain them. But there is a process under which a hearing has to be held to make that determination. And at that hearing, the accused has counsel. The prosecutor can put forth whatever evidence they think can persuade a judge that this person should be detained. But it is at least transparent, more objective, right? And honestly, just more honest. Like, let's get it out in the open and talk about what the fear is here. And what is the least restrictive way you can return this person to the community, if at all? Right? There might be other, intermediate ways to release somebody to the community. House arrest, right? That's one of the ones that people use, if that's a concern. So the answer is yes. In that legislation in Illinois, but Illinois is the only place that eliminated cash bail entirely. It was about to go into effect, and then there was a lawsuit. Lawyers, I am one, but boy, sometimes we just are impossible. So the Kankakee prosecutor, this was a prosecutor, brought the lawsuit in Kankakee, Illinois, and basically said the statute's unconstitutional, and that now, so the PFA, the Pretrial Fairness Act, is on hold while it goes up to the Illinois Supreme Court, who will determine for the entire state whether there are unconstitutional provisions in the statute. So we're on hold with that. That's going to be heard. I think arguments are January and February, and in March, we hope that there'll be some sort of decision. So that's the first state to eliminate all cash bail. New Jersey eliminated lots of cash bail in lots of cases many, many years ago in what was then a bipartisan, I know that word is almost never used anymore, a bipartisan movement that was led by Cory Booker and Chris Christie together to do an overhaul of the cash bail system in New Jersey, to great results. New York did legislation a couple of years ago. It passed last year. Then there was the inevitable pushback. And so there are now some crimes where you can't, people charged with certain things, you can't set cash bail, but you can in others. And there's a lot of pushback there. So that's still sort of an ongoing story, but at least it's an improvement. And it did lead to reducing Rikers Island from when I started practicing in 1982. Yes, I'm that old. Rikers Island had almost 20,000 people in it and now has 6,000 people in it. It is still a horrendous place that needs to close, but you can see the decarceratory effects that are happening. So that's a good thing.
Okay, I want to get some of the chat questions in.
Sure.
So one had to do with the Humphrey case. So I just want to let people know, in March 2021, the California Supreme Court ruled that detaining a person pre-trial solely because they cannot afford bail violates due process and equal protection under the Humphrey case. How come there hasn't been a change in the bail schedule, which is LA County's formal guidelines for the cash amounts based on the alleged offenses? So they passed this, but so why hasn't there been?
Well, because they didn't pass anything. That was a legal case. And what we all like to think is when we have a legal case and there's a victory, that's going to fix the problem. And so I will just remind you, because most of you are old enough to remember Brown versus Board of Education. Do we think that has solved our problem in our public school system? No. So it's very similar, which is lawsuits are great. They are one strategy, right? But they are only one strategy, because you can bring a case, you can get a really good ruling. A judge, like in the Humphrey case, can say setting excessive bail is unconstitutional, right? So there's a constitutional prohibition against setting excessive bail, right? At the federal level and at the state level. So that's written in there. And the Humphrey case was basically saying, hey, judges setting bail according to the bail schedule doesn't take into account how much money somebody has, and that's not fair, that's unconstitutional, and by the way, drives systemic racism. And the court said, you're absolutely right. Every judge should look at it and say, this is how much money the person has, and set bail, right, that they can make that is is aligned with how much money they have. And so that's what the court ruled, and judges don't follow it. And when I say judges don't follow it, I mean no judges follow it almost. UCLA Law and Alicia Verani, who runs our criminal justice program there, just actually released a study in the past 6 months that tracked the results of the decarceratory effects of Humphreys and how effective it has been. And unfortunately, the result was judges aren't following it. Now, whether judges aren't following it because they don't understand it, they haven't been retrained, they haven't been educated, completely possible that that is a large portion of it, or they don't agree with it, that we would have to figure out, but it is not being followed in the way that you hope when you bring a lawsuit and there's a good decision that it'll be followed, right? But it's not any different than other things you see, right? So if you sue the police for unlawful search and seizure, like we did in New York, unlawful searches and seizures still go on. You hope they go on less often, but they still go on. And so the law can only go so far, right? What it really requires is grassroots organizing, people really getting educated around this issue, voting for people that will actually follow the law and that will actually care about this issue, right? And then moving legislation forward that would actually prohibit cash bail from being sent. I think that is, it's going to be a whole bunch of strategies.
So, I want to just follow this up and then I'll get you. So back in 2020, we all voted on Prop 25, which was to replace cash bail. And that was passed by our legislature in 2018. And then there was a referendum, you know, just like we keep getting where, oh, we don't like what the legislature just passed. And so it got put on our ballot as a proposition and it failed. And it divided the end cash bail community. So I
Divided everybody.
It divided everybody. And part of that has to do with some of the questions that are in chat, but it has to do with what should the criteria be in terms of ending, you know, just like you were giving examples there, what should the criteria be? Because that's where people thought that this legislation gave too much power to the judges to decide, you know, and also that algorithm in terms.
Well, right.
So maybe you could talk to that, because that goes into what should be the criteria, what should we all be fighting for. So,
you know, SB 10 was the first bill and that's what passed. And then the bail bond industry actually got the signatures to get it back on the ballot for a referendum, which, by the way, being from New York, I do not understand how you do this. Like I'm looking at these recalls and I'm like, who does this? But anyway, that's a different conversation for another day. I'm still learning it. I'm still learning it. And I'm all for the citizenry being able to speak up, but it's a little bit destabilizing sometimes. So what happened is then the next legislation comes up on the ballot, and you are right that there is controversy even within the end cash bail sort of movement of progressive organizations. And the reason is that the statute as it passed, SB 10, relied on risk algorithms, which are called RATs, risk assessment tools. They are algorithms that basically put data in and spit out an answer about whether somebody should be released or not released. What you all know about data is put in bad data, it's going to spit out bad results. And the concern that a lot of the progressive community had in the end cash bail movement was the data that it rested on was prior criminal justice data, which we know has been largely driven by a criminal legal system that is embedded with systemic racism. It was more a reflection of where do police than it was about who's a risk and who's not a risk. And you know that because children that look like my children didn't get arrested for things, right, that their friends at the same age who looked different and lived in different neighborhoods were getting arrested for in New York City for forever, right? Whether that's drug possession or getting in a fight in the schoolyard, our system responds differently, right? And that is just a reflection of systemic racism. That is our legacy to still grapple with all the time, right? And so if you're looking at a system and saying, well, we'll rely on previous criminal justice history, you're gonna perpetuate the same systemic racism that existed when we were policing the way we were policing during the sort of years of mass incarceration, right? And so, and still are, but I like to think we're moving into a new place. So that was one of the objections. The other objection was, I think in a perfect world, you would want supportive services to be part of what you think about when somebody's released. And the pretrial services was basically going to be housed in probation. Probation is a law enforcement arm. There's no other way to describe it. That's what they do. And so people had very strong objections to that as well and thought it should be more independent agency and at least community-based. So there were a lot of objections to, it didn't move the needle on racial justice. And so it was like you'd eliminate cash bail, but you wouldn't move the needle on racial justice. We thought we could do better. And I think that's what people are still fighting for, and not relying on algorithms that are flawed at the outset.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask, is there a model outside of the U.S.? How do other countries handle this situation?
So some countries have.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. The question was, how do other countries deal with this issue? And are we the only ones, I guess, right? So we are the only country in the world except the Philippines that has a bail bond industry. So we are the only place next to the Philippines that has developed a for-profit entity, right, that responds to the cash bail system. Other countries definitely have cash bail. Other countries have some of the same similar issues around cash bail, but a bail bond industry, right, we are the real creators of that in the Philippines. And I don't know about the Philippines, I just know it exists there. And that might explain a lot about mass incarceration as well, right? If cash bail is driving mass incarceration and we have a for-profit bail bond industry that's operating at a multi-billion-dollar annual level, you can really begin to see its effects. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you can also give your opinion, Carolina is asking also, in terms of when you do the risk assessment, so there could be where you say, well, we're not going to put you in jail, but you have to be at your house. We're going to either I don't know, there's different ways to monitor someone. What is your, when they do the assessment, what do you think needs to be part of their criteria for saying, yeah, you're not in jail, but.
I mean, I think, I would love to see our system, you were talking earlier about moving our system to more care and support. It would be really amazing if what we did when somebody entered the criminal legal system was start with a needs assessment rather than a risk assessment. If we started with a needs assessment, that might get us a long way to recognizing what somebody might need when they're back in the community to be supported and be successful and thrive, right? We don't do that, right? We do a risk assessment. The other thing we don't do is we do a risk assessment on this side of the ledger, if you want to divide it that way. What's the risk to folks on the other side of the jail? We do no risk assessments at all about what is the potential harm that's going to come to this person or this person's family, right? Do they struggle with mental health issues? Do they have physical issues? Are they 65 and over? Like, what are the issues, right? Are they transgender? Are there things that make them more vulnerable? What is the risk to them in jail? That part of an assessment's also not done, right? Which I also think would need to be done. If you're going to have a system that has a hearing to determine, right, whether this person presents a clear and unequivocal, as unequivocal as you can get, a clear danger to somebody, right, or a community if they were to be released, and there's going to be a hearing that's going to determine that, I think you also still have to look at the risk if you hold somebody and do a needs assessment. If you do the needs assessment, you'll get very far in recognizing what you might be able to do to let somebody be released, right? So that they can actually stay out of the system again and people can be safe, right? If you have unmet needs, you're going to be more likely to commit a crime. That's part of the equation. Yeah.
What just before that? As a follow-up, because this has been on chat. So in the needs assessment, some people are talking about the judges who are elected where they've ruled on something and then that case gets thrown, that something happens, maybe bad.
Yep.
And so, so they're always tending to rule to save their butt, right? Or and so when you do this needs assessment, would that solve that problem, in terms, because they can then point, we're transparent, this is. Yeah,
the only thing that's going to solve that problem is courage. I'm sorry, but the only thing that's going to solve the problem, look, you're never going to get it 100% right. There is always going to be an outlier, right? So I think a really interesting case is this one, right? So the guy who just got charged, I don't know if he's guilty or not guilty, but the guy who just got charged in the Idaho case, right? Going into the home in the middle of the night and allegedly murdering 4 young people, right? I promise you, if that guy had shown up in front of a judge, he would have been released. Not on the charge, before. Like, is there anything about that person that's going to get it right every time, right? We rely on the outliers. We're like, but it's scary. Yeah, it's scary. The outliers are the outliers, right? That guy's a graduate student, right? He's got a supportive family. Like, you can't always know, but you have some pretty good indicators, right? And what we have to have courage about is to understand a couple things. Number one, there's always going to be a bad story, and there's always going to be an outlier. And the only way you get through that is to rely on what happens most of the time, not rarely. And you rely on the data, right, to show you actually that most of the time you're getting it right. But there's always going to be a bad story. There's always going to be an outlier that you couldn't have predicted. That's just human nature. Unless somebody has figured out a way to actually have a crystal ball to look into human nature, forget it, or life circumstances, you don't. But you can get it right the overwhelming majority of the time, right? Where we need courage is judges need to be emboldened, right? That if something goes wrong, if they've done the best they can, they've had the hearing to determine what they need to, it's based on evidence, right? It's all been done well, fairly, right? In a way that's not perpetuating the things that we are trying to end in our criminal legal system. And it goes bad and somebody commits another crime, that you all aren't going to start having a recall, right? That's on us. Like, we have to be powerful and strong enough to say, you know what? Like, actually, the judge did the best they could with what they had in front of them. The prosecutor did the best they could with what they had in front of them. The defender, God knows, was doing the best they could with what they had in front of them. And we're not always going to get it right. That doesn't, and I don't mean to say cavalierly that when something bad happens, it's not heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And we should really do a deep dive into what could we have done differently? Did we miss something that we could have seen? Is there some way for this to learn from it for next time, right? But we all have to have the courage to basically say, look, if they followed all the procedural rules and they've done the best they can, we're never going to get it 100% right. But the alternative is you are holding literally millions of people in jail cells to prevent the very rare bad story from happening, with utter disregard for the over 2 million people a year that get held in our jails. 500,000 people are sleeping in a jail cell tonight because they don't have enough money to pay cash bail. Right? And so that has to be part of what we think about. And we have to not react that way and to stay grounded, and to take our own advice, which is, I don't know how many of you have kids, but whenever my kids have been in a crisis, I've always said to them, you do not make a decision when you're in the middle of a crisis. Wait, take a breath, ground yourself, and then make a decision. And instead what happens is something goes bad, the newspapers get on it, the police feed the story to the media runs with it because it sells papers, because it makes people watch television, right? And we're off to the races, do away with the judge, recall the judge, change the bail, make people not be able to get bail, right? And we have to just take a step back. And I know how hard that is because it's scary, right? Because crime's scary and nobody wants to be the victim of a crime in any community anywhere. But we have to be better about that and remind each other, right, that as long as somebody's done the best they could, you can't predict everything, and it's never going to be perfect, but we're doing the best we can. And that to overcompensate by holding people in jails literally means you're willing to subject millions of people to the possibility of death and to the absolute 100% certainty of being in dehumanizing, cruel, unjust, and violent circumstances in a jail cell.
Tony?
Thank you. We're also one of the few countries that elect our judges, so that's another factor in the equation. I'm not sure if this was said already, but it seems that the overwhelming majority of bail reform that's happened, that's been successful, has been the local system, legal system, working out a contract with the person who is brought before the criminal justice system. So they work out a contract with them, and by and large, they fulfill those contracts and come back to court. Correct?
I don't know any data or evidence that that's the best solution, or what you're referring to.
It seems to be working out there. That for the majority of people who bail affects, it's these nonviolent crimes. These are financial issues that they return to court because of a contract with the legal system that they've signed to come back free from bail.
Just repeat.
So the question is, or I guess the assertion is, that there is some system where there's a contract with the accused, and to come back to court, on at least some misdemeanor. I don't know what jurisdictions you're talking about where that's happening, and that's been very effective in getting people to come back to court.
Okay, you're not aware of it.
I mean, here's what I would argue. I'd argue if we're paying cash bail with philanthropic dollars and people are coming back 92% of the time, we don't have a contract. So I don't know why you need a contract with anybody, and who monitors the contract, and what are the terms of the contract.
An alternative to bail that
Yeah.
was tried in other municipalities that seemed to work, where rather than having them post bail, they work out a contract with the court system, come back to court. But you're not aware of it. That's okay. We can.
Yeah.
move on.
Yeah.
I do, Kent, he had his hand raised and then he put it down and he made a nice chat. But I do
great.
want you to read it, Kent, because it is very good. So maybe you can unmute yourself and say it.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I wasn't sure if you could take live voice from the Zoom people anyway. Anyway, I wanted to thank you for your very lucid and effective talk. I've been in jail before, so I mean, not prison, but just jail, just minor stuff. So I know what goes on in there. I'm just wondering, I already write my state and federal legislators about this problem, and I'm wondering if there's anything else I can do that may be more effective to change the system.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for sharing your story, and I'm sorry that you experienced that. I would say that writing your elected officials is really important. I'd say educating people that really important. Like, sit around and have these conversations around the dining room table. People just do not understand how they operate. Court watch programs that might be happening in jurisdictions that actually go into court and watch judges as they do jail. Those are really interesting. Also, get educated on who you're electing as judges and as district attorneys and what their position is on cash bail. It will tell you a lot about their politics generally and whether they really actually care about the things they say they care about, right? So get educated about that, get other people educated. It's very hard when you're looking at a slate of candidates who are judges to know what they stand for. I had that problem in this past election here in Los Angeles. There were so many people on the ballot and I was like, oh, wow, I don't even know how to learn about those judges. So we need to get better about getting that information out and just knowing what people stand for. Asking people to get proximate to the problem is always really interesting. I will tell you that some of the people that have funded the bail project, the way they got interested was I took them to court and I had them watch as cash bail got set, and people were horrified by what they saw in the criminal legal system itself. People like to think it's over there and they don't really see it except on television. But when you go see it in person, I think it's really motivating for people, and to just know who we're electing and why, and to get involved. That I don't think there is more we can do than that. And remind people that people that get arrested are cycling through the criminal legal system are human beings. They're not other. And that they have a, real potential for coming back into the community and thriving. And so, I mean, it's really incumbent on all of us to have these conversations all the time and not fall prey to the scary, horrible story and the stereotypes that we develop around them.
So I want to just go back here, because you had given examples in terms of other states, but we have an example right here in LA County during the pandemic, where they were trying to reduce population in the jails, and they eliminated cash bail. So, and it got eliminated in the spring of 2020, and it got terminated in June 2022. So, and there's plenty of evidence about how there wasn't a rise in crime and people came to their trials. So maybe.
Right. So COVID was this, in some ways, the worst of times, the best of times. It did provide a really interesting window for those of us in the field, almost like a natural experiment that you saw, which was when COVID first hit and it was really spreading, you couldn't be in a worse place than being in jail, right? You are vulnerable, you have no access to healthcare, you can't physically distance. I mean, it's just horrendous. And you might actually get sick and die, right, being charged with a petty larceny. I mean, that was how serious it was. And so jurisdictions around the country began to decarcerate around COVID and do COVID releases. LA County did a zero bail initiative, which I think only targeted people charged with misdemeanors, and began just basically citing and releasing people rather than risk the possibility that they were going to get COVID and die in jail. And you're quite right that what you saw was, the sky didn't fall, the world didn't come to an end, terrible things didn't happen, and you began to decarcerate. But to my point that systems don't go down without a fight, what we had hoped was this would provide the incentive for jurisdictions to basically say, okay, we're going to hold, right? We're not going to refill our jails, and we're not going to continue to build up our pretrial population. The bigger problem is you began to see homicide rates rise, not by folks you were letting out on misdemeanors and a zero cash bail. You began to see some homicide rates and some categories of violent crime rising, by the way, across the country in places that didn't have zero cash bail, like LA. You saw it everywhere, like it was rising. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if you isolate people and you evaporate social services and people are struggling with mental health issues and people are isolated from each other and substance use is going up and we're buying and selling more guns in those 2 years in 2020 and 22 than we ever have in our history, that's going to have a bad result for humankind. All of those factors. I don't know why that seems so strange to people. And what you see now is homicide rates are beginning to actually level off and go down, which is also not that surprising if you think about some of the destabilizing effects of COVID, while not gone completely, are beginning to actually communities are beginning to stabilize more. So you would imagine that you'd see them go down. Has nothing to do with cash bail. So, what we're hoping is people can begin to use that data and actually recognize that there was no causal relationship between some of the rises in homicide rates or some of the other cases and ending cash bail, because most people didn't end cash bail. Most jurisdictions didn't end cash bail across America.
For your project, 5 to 8% of the people that didn't come back?
Yeah.
Are there any consistent patterns?
Such a great question, and I should have said it, so thank you for asking it. So what we have learned, the question is, in the folks that didn't come back to court, right, where a bench warrant had to be issued, what were we learning from that? Was there any reason for that? And what I can tell you is nobody fled the jurisdiction, and mostly it was life happened, right? Mostly it was, my boss said if I took another day off from work, I'd lose my job. Somebody falls back into substance use. My kids, we moved someplace else. Like, it was life circumstances that really sort of, I think, affect low-income communities more than other more wealthy, more well-resourced communities that would come up, that would prevent people from coming back. There was almost no intentional flight.
It wasn't like your case was a tough one.
No. I mean, here's what's really interesting. Because Los Angeles had the zero cash bail during the period of COVID, we wound up paying bail for people charged with much higher bails than most places in the country, and charged very often with quite serious offenses. And we had the highest return rate in the country here, even though people are charged with more serious offenses. So there's no relationship between that either. It was interesting.
Do you have an idea why?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, the counterintuitive part of this is, and this is why charge-based distinctions are always problematic for me. It's like, you can have somebody charged with a misdemeanor repeatedly over and over and over and over again, and that's technically a low-level crime, but sometimes that actually indicates that there's a big need that's going unmet, whether it's substance use issues, whether it's, being unhoused, whether it's mental health struggles, whatever the things are. That actually sometimes needs more supportive services than somebody charged with a very serious case but isn't struggling from the same things. So it may have something to do with that, but I'm not sure, and we don't really know what the data is there. But it certainly wasn't, because transportation is easy, because goodness knows it's not. But we had like a 98% return rate in Compton, where we were operating a site for years. So
just wanted to get, so there is a case now. It came out in, I guess it was filed in, I thought it was filed this last year in November, but maybe I have anyway, 6 LA residents, who have been jailed, and they are now, and they couldn't afford to pay bail. And so they're the first case that's been filed to challenge the LA's bail schedule. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, just like in terms of what Kent was saying on the Zoom, Is that something also that your bail project would support, that kind of a case?
Yes, so we don't bring lawsuits ourselves, even though I'm a lawyer. But what we do, and so that's a lawsuit that was brought in conjunction with Civil Rights Corps, I want to say,
It was,
with Public Justice.
Public justice
Yeah.
and this pastor.
And, right.
Yeah.
So what we have done is when there are lawsuits, we provide data for those lawsuits often. Because what the judges are looking for is evidence, right, of what happens and when people get held and what return rates are. And so our organization is really doing the bailout work. We're also doing the policy work to eliminate cash bail, but not by bringing lawsuits, although we will sometimes join those lawsuits, provide information or data for those lawsuits, or just work along with our partners in the field if we think it's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I can speak for all of us that we're delighted you moved to California.
Well, I am too, so thank you.
But is there, you talked about your fund in the Bronx.
Yeah.
Is there something similar here that you're setting up?
Well, that's the Bail Project. So it is the national. So the Bail Project is a national not-for-profit 501c3, and we provide, interventions by providing bail to the 30 different places that we're operating right now. Yeah. So same idea, same theory, just on a national level. Yeah.
So I think Congresswomen Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert are now converts to this because they feel very badly for the January 6th insurrection.
Like I said, it's a bipartisan issue. It's a bipartisan issue. The question for those folks charged in the January 6th incident would be, are they a clear and present danger to somebody or a community if they were to be released? Same standard should hold. I think I genuinely mean it when I say this should be a bipartisan issue. It really is about fundamental fairness. It is really about the presumption of innocence. It is really about equal justice under the law. And it's really about doing a fair and open and transparent assessment about whether somebody poses a risk to a particular person or community and whether there's evidence to that fact. Not stereotypes, again, not about race, not about class, not about where you live, but actual evidence that somebody is a risk to public safety, then that seems like a legitimate way for a judge to exercise his or her discretion. But barring that, and I'm sure in that January 6th, folks, you would do that analysis and find that some people may present a clear and present danger and some people may not. And you have to live by the principles, right? So I would argue both ways.
So to follow up on the electing good legislators and electing good judges, do you guys have wording, because that proposition went down, the legislature?
Well, it was also really confusing.
And
nobody knew what was happening and why,
Right,
and it was really.
So have you proposed some code or something that we can put, it's kind of like even what Kent was saying, is there some language that we're presenting to our legislator that we want them to vote on? Just to determine, who should be locked up for public safety and who shouldn't be.
Again, so yes, so who should be locked up and who shouldn't be? I'm just going to say this one thing because I feel like I need to keep saying it. Holding somebody pretrial in detention should be the rare, not the norm.
Right.
Okay, so we just need to keep reminding ourselves, like it should be the exception, not the rule, because you don't need it to be the rule, right? So what I would say is we have not written model legislation. What we do have is something on our website called After Cash Bail. It's the document that we've created that basically says in any legislation that you were to create, here are the things that are important to remember. And this is what a system would look like that would be fair, that would go at least move the needle on racial justice forward, and that we think would provide some procedural protections. But we certainly will, if somebody has legislation, we're certainly happy to talk with them about it and give our opinion about where it could get better. The Illinois statute really was an incredible coalition of grassroots, not-for-profits, local elected officials, policymakers in Illinois who really got together and moved that bill. And it is, it puts New York to shame. It's a gold standard bill. It's really good. Let's hope it stays that way, but it's a really good bill. And it's because it had a lot of support at a lot of different levels. And I think you have to operate at all those different levels to get a bill like that. That said, don't underestimate how impactful So change can happen at the big statewide legislative level, but that's a big lift, right? Let's not give up. Let's try to move it forward. But also change can happen at the local level, right? If you elect George Gascon to be the Los Angeles district attorney, right, he's going to make different decisions about when his assistants ask for cash bail and when they don't, and going to set a policy that is fair or more just and is going to move the needle forward on racial justice, as opposed to somebody else that you might elect for the DA. So it can happen at the local level, it can happen at the city level, it can happen at the state level, it can happen at the federal level. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there was literally a bail schedule where the sheriff set the bail, but there was no review for weeks of that bail that got set at the jail by the sheriff. When they created a bail docket, that just meant that a judge would review the case and review the bail that got set within that first 48 hours of the person being arrested, led to real numbers decreasing in pretrial detention. Right? So it can be that kind of change also that happens. I also think, frankly, I think judges need to be better educated about the bail system and how it operates. They're doing a lot. And unfortunately, one of the ways judges learn how to be judges is they learn from senior judges, right? So I used to remember in the Bronx, like the new judge would get elected and sit on the bench with the judge who's been there for a really long time. And I'd be like, oh, that's just going to perpetuate the same problem. So there needs to be sort of a different way to think about how you train new judges up on the bench, how you train judges that are on the bench who've been there for a while, about the very, very complicated changing landscape of cash bail, and how it operates. And that's, that's just an educational piece that all of us in the system need. Prosecutors, defenders, frankly, defenders as well. I have sat and talked to many public defenders who are my people. They are my colleagues. That is where I come from, who, don't really advocate very strongly for bail for their clients, right? And that's another place. There's lots of different culture shifts that need to happen in the criminal justice system, at the judiciary level, at the level of the prosecutors and defenders as well. We're all part of that system. And so, that three-legged stool needs to do better and educate ourselves better and pay more attention to what's happening up front. Because what happens up front is going to determine almost everything that happens afterwards. That's why, when I thought about what was the thing I wanted to do after being a public defender, you can fantasize about maybe I'll become a judge and I'll just release people. And then I thought, and then they'll drag me off to traffic court and I'll never see a criminal courtroom again. So that's not going to work for very long. But this was really an opportunity to get at the front end of the system, right, and intervene before incarceration happens and before. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.
I want to, Denzi has put up something here on chat in terms of his daughter who works with the Unison Project, and who had also just met with our speaker who didn't make it today, Christine Soto DeBerry. But she is the founder of the Prosecutors Alliance, and one of the documents that guides them, and I'm going to put this also in our newsletter, is called 21 Principles of the 21st Century Prosecutor. Mm-hmm. And they have a section there about ending cash bail, and they spell it out pretty well. Yeah. But for those of you who are following what George Gascon is doing, and also our speaker had also worked with Bodine, who got recalled. Yeah, got recalled. Yeah. But she's worked with both of them, and it is a challenge for our prosecutors to be progressive and to have courage. But this is a very good document, and I will make sure that you all have a link to it. So, but I was hoping that she would talk to that, and also some articles that she has actually co-authored with George Gascon. But just in one last thing, there is a case also that was in 2018 where someone was in jail. He became a plaintiff in a class action suit for the Prison Law Office and Disability Rights. And they brought this against Sacramento County, and they were in jail for 40 years, or nearly 40 years. They're now out, but you're talking about people who are waiting and sometimes end up pleading guilty and being put in. So this is someone who ended up going through, and before they could get their case re-looked at, they were already in jail for 40 years. So there's really bad cases on both sides are out. Maybe, I don't know if they're outliers, but I know the Innocence Project, they have a lot of cases that they deal with that are people who are innocent.
The Innocence Project is, look, it's a great organization. My daughter worked there as well. And one of the things I like about it, you know, obviously nobody wants somebody innocent in prison, that goes without saying. And in that way, that's the obvious piece. But the less obvious piece is what they've been able to do is they can shine a light on where the systems fail, right? And so that's some of the really important work I think they do. Of course, it's really important to bring people home that they can, and they've done that with hundreds and hundreds of people. But what's also really important is it shines a light on what happened here, what failed here, how did this wind up happening, whether it was a false confession. Yes, people confess falsely all the time. I know people think they don't. I promise you they do. And I always, you know, say to people, if you put me in a jail cell long enough, I would say that I was the one who killed JFK. Seriously. Like, you just, it is the kind of pressure that people are under, you know, to plead guilty. So yes, they show things about false confessions or the way that identification procedures are faulty. And really don't operate very well. Cross-racial identification procedures are particularly tricky because actually, despite the fact that people always say, I'll never forget that face, people actually do a really bad job at identifying people, right? And so they expose a lot of the systemic problems as well as obviously bringing people home, which is so critical.
Okay, we've reached 4 o'clock and I don't see any more on chat. And so this is just your time to summarize, and if you have any last minute, it's just been a delight.
Yikes, I don't think if anybody has any questions, I'll answer them.
And by the way, I want to say the last time I heard Robin speak, she started out with, I talk fast, I'm from New York, and
which you can tell, but delighted to now be in California. So I'll never stop talking fast, but I am much more patient on grocery lines now than I ever was in New York. It's like I literally say to myself standing in line, see, you're in California, just calm down. It's going to be okay. So, no, I appreciate your coming. I appreciate your interest in this issue. And, you know, just to remind everybody, I guess I said this in our call, that if you think it doesn't impact you, if you think it doesn't impact your family, to remember 2 things. One, as I said at the beginning, that it reflects all of our values, and what happens in the criminal justice system is a reflection on us, and we have to be accountable for it. But whether you know it or not, whether people talk about it or not, whether people have said it publicly or not, 1 out of 2 American families in this country have had an immediate loved one booked into a jail cell at some point. So, and I had somebody once test me on that. We were at a very conservative think tank meeting, and that is data that comes from the Pew Institute, not from me. And I said that data, and they were like, that's not true. I said, all right, close the door. Just close the door. All microphones, all cameras off. Go ahead. Really, some of the most privileged people in the, let's really raise your hand honestly. Do you know somebody in your family who has ever booked into a jail cell? You would be astounded at how many people were like, oh yeah, my brother when he was in college, my fraternity's brother here. Like it is, you know, with the expansion of criminalizing everything and really our decision that I hope we're finally turning back for decades to solve what are fundamentally social problems with handcuffs and jail cells and patrol cars. What that led to was, right, the overexpansion of criminalization, a massive increase in police departments, right, and the use of jails and handcuffs to solve those problems. And so what you really know is that there are millions and millions and millions of people, whether you know them or not, who are walking around with criminal records and who have had immediate loved ones booked into a jail cell. And so when you think you're talking to people and they haven't, some of them have. And to remember that, like, there's no other here. It's all of us, right? They're friends and mothers and fathers and colleagues and friends and fellow students. And that makes us all responsible for what's happening.
Okay, thank you.
I'll get off my soapbox.
Oh, very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.